Hi and welcome back to my channel. I'm Sarah and I am the Wallowing Widow. So I thought for this video I would go over the treatment that my husband Ian had for his stage 4 bowel cancer and rough dates and just a quick explanation of them, just as a bit of background and potentially some information for anybody else who is about to embark on this journey as well. So roughly the end of July 2022, without being too much information, Ian went to the toilet and ended up passing a lot of blood. Ian was in the military, so he immediately rang the medical centre for an urgent appointment and they booked him in. I think it was for maybe the next day, and so we spent the rest of the day trying not to panic, saying potentially it could be something like piles and whatnot, and everything would be fine. So the next day in he went and had the internal examination. He always used to say the old finger up the bum, and they couldn't feel anything obvious, and so he was immediately referred for a colonoscopy. The colonoscopy happened, I think, August 18th-ish, 2022, and he was told there and then that they'd found something that was highly likely to be cancer. I think the gentleman's words were, he'd rather say and be wrong than, reassure and say it's not cancer and be right. They took a biopsy, which unfortunately bled, so they had to put a clip on, so he had to spend a night in hospital. But then he came away and was booked in for a CT scan, which happened fairly quickly. I don't remember the exact date, but I think it was in a week or so. And then on the 31st of August, he had an appointment at North Tyneside Hospital, northeast of England, where the colorectal surgeon sat us down and explained that the biopsy did show that it was bowel cancer, and the scan had shown that it has also spread to his liver. So it was quite a blow, and it was quite a difficult appointment, and unfortunately it was one of those sort of sad faces, tilty head, can't be much fun for them, as much as it was no fun for us. And she explained that Ian would be referred to oncology to start palliative chemotherapy. We left that appointment absolutely, devastated. We weren't really sure what was happening. Ian's birthday is the 10th of September, and I had not long bought his birthday presents, and he was really into paddle boarding. So I'd bought him a new paddle, like a one that was more of an oar, so he could get a bit more speed up, and I'd got him one of those dry robes for getting changed when he got out. And I weirdly panicked that he wasn't going to get a chance to use those things, that he was going to open them on his birthday, or potentially, we both said we weren't sure if he was going to make it till the weekend. It felt that scary. So the next steps, he had an MRI on his liver to get a full idea of how many tumours and whatnot there were, and he had a PET scan, and that was on the 5th of September, and that was to show where else it was in his body. He then met with his oncologist for the first time on the 27th of September 2022. We have 3 kids, 3 teenagers, and it was around this time that I told our eldest 2 that their dad had cancer and that it was stage 4 cancer. On the 11th of October 2022, Ian started his first round of chemo, and this was a chemo called Capox. It's actually 2 chemotherapies, an infusion of oxaliplatin, which is a platinum-based chemotherapy, and 2 weeks of tablets called capecitabine, capecitabine. There's lots of different ways. We always called it capecitabine. But yes, so that was his first round. Sometimes you'll hear people having Folfox instead, which is the exact same chemo, but instead of the tablets, it's just another infusion, and I think they have a pump that stays on for a couple of days, but it's the same drug. So Ian was due to have 8 rounds of Capox, being scanned after 4 to see how it was going. So he did the 4, and the scan showed that the chemo was working on the cancer, but it hadn't done enough. So it had reduced the bowel tumour, and it had reduced some of the liver tumours, but it hadn't done enough to make him a surgical candidate. We weren't told right away that that was the case. We were told that he'd be put on a list to be seen by the MDT, and they would decide if he'd have surgery. At that point, Ian still thought that he would have surgery, they would take the cancer out and he would be cured. I, being somebody who needs all the information, had found out how this was likely to go, and so I was less relaxed, shall we say, and I could tell somewhat from the oncologist's body language that there wasn't going to be a good result, but I think she was just trying to put it off for a bit potentially. But about a week or so later, he had his oncologist appointment in the morning, and that afternoon he had his 5th round of chemo. So he left that feeling quite buoyed. He went on to have his 5th round of Capox, and it was probably one of the better rounds that he'd had, because Capox is quite a challenging chemotherapy. But he had quite a good round and felt quite high, quite lifted. And a week later we were called back in to the oncologist, not knowing why. We thought maybe she just wanted to check, because after your 1st round you meet with them to make sure everything's going okay, so we thought maybe it's the same as that. And she let us know that the team had sat and that they had decided that there wasn't going to be any surgery, which was a complete blow, as you can probably appreciate, and it led to us both feeling quite devastated. But we kicked on as best we could, and Ian had 3 further rounds of Capox and was rescanned. At that appointment, his doctor confirmed that the chemo had made the cancer stable, but it hadn't had any further reductions, because our hope was that actually the chemo had continued to work and maybe reduced it further so that he could have surgery. But all it had done is stabilise the cancer. So she then gave Ian 2 choices. One was to go on to maintenance chemotherapy, and that would have consisted of just the tablets. So he would have stayed with the side effects of those tablets, which are nausea, fatigue, and makes your platelet levels, your white blood cells quite low, and it can be tricky to manage. Or he could just have a 3-month break completely free from chemotherapy. She explained to us that the overall effect on life expectancy was the same. One wasn't better than the other. Potentially with staying on maintenance chemotherapy, you would hold the cancer stable for a bit longer, and then there would be potentially a sudden decline. However, with a break, you would just find a more gradual potential decline. So Ian chose to have 3 months of being normal. So we went and did park runs, out on the paddleboard, we went bike rides, we just enjoyed our summer with the kids. About 6 weeks into his chemo break, he had some blood tests done. We weren't given the results of those blood tests until much later on, but I did discover later on that so there's something called CEA. I can't remember the full name, but I'll add it in as a caption, and it's basically a tumour marker. So it shouldn't be relied on its own. For some people it is a reliable marker, for some it isn't. Some people have really high numbers and cancer can stay stable, some people have really low numbers and it cannot be stable. So Ian's numbers always trended low, but it was accurate as a trend. So if the numbers were declining, his cancer was shrinking or stable, and if they were going up, then his cancer was growing. So I later discovered at that 6-week point that when they checked those CEA levels, it had risen quite significantly, but they didn't tell us. I did ask for the results, but they wouldn't give them to me for whatever reason. At the end of his 3-month break, he had a CT scan, and they confirmed to us that, in fact, the cancer in the bowel and the liver was in fact growing, and he needed to go back on chemo. So he started his next type of chemo called Capiri, and that is another infusion called irinotecan, and again the same tablets, the capecitabine tablets. It was at this point as well that Ian requested to have a port inserted, because oxaliplatin, being a platinum-based chemotherapy, absolutely destroyed his veins. It was awful, really painful, and at no point was he offered anything like a PICC line or a port, and so he said, I'd like a port. They explained that irinotecan didn't have the same effect on the veins, and he would likely be okay. But by that point, he had quite significant trauma around IVs because of the pain. And he said, no, thank you, I would like one. So they did book him in, but he had his first round of Capiri through IV. So he had his first round of Capiri on the 28th of July, 2023, and he had his port inserted on the 8th of August. After we had the appointment where Ian was told that he wasn't a surgical candidate, I actually started looking abroad for options. I discovered that there was a trial for liver transplants for stage 4 cancer patients. In the UK, whilst this trial exists, the criteria for it is very strict. But I discovered that the German version of the trial Ian was a candidate for, unfortunately he would have to self-fund the trial, and I was given a very approximate cost of 250,000 euros, which obviously made it completely untenable, and I stopped looking, feeling quite despondent at that point. Just shortly after started Capiri, we started looking for second opinions in the UK. I got a second opinion from a private oncologist who agreed, this was before Ian had started Capiri, he agreed that, you know, within the NHS system, Ian's treatment had been correct and there were limited options to him, and that probably having the 3-month break was, you know, the correct thing to do in his circumstances. But after Ian started Capiri, we started reaching out for private surgical options, and we spoke to Dr. Jamie Murphy down in London, who said that there was a procedure called SIRT, S-A-R-T, again I'll put the name down here, and if the cancer would stabilise, then Ian would be a candidate for this procedure. Unfortunately, after 4 rounds of Capiri, Ian had a CT scan, and whilst he did start his 5th round before we got the results, unfortunately the cancer was still growing despite being on this chemo. So this unfortunately meant he was not eligible for any of these surgical options, and he needed to switch chemo. He requested to go back onto Capox because that had worked previously, and they agreed. So he immediately started Capox. It was at this point as well that I had learnt about the privately available drug called Avastin, and we inquired about adding that to his regime, but we had to switch trusts for that, which we started the procedure of doing. So he had his first round of Capox without it. He then, once we'd switched trusts and set up the payment for it, he then went on to have 3 further rounds of Capox with Avastin. Avastin is the brand name, bevacizumab is the drug name. And it was at this point that I was then looking for more options because I wasn't happy. Ian at that point was still incredibly well mentally, and for somebody who had terminal cancer, physically as well. And I discovered a doctor in Germany who does a procedure called TACE, which is transarterial chemoembolization, and that's where they put chemo directly into the liver. So we travelled to Rochdale to have a chat with a nurse who'd worked with this doctor, and we sent off the referral in March of 2024. The Germans, being known for their efficiency, had Ian straight in, and on March 12th he had his first round of TACE with Professor Vogel in Frankfurt. The difference in just the speed of treatment and getting test results and whatnot was just night and day. And Ian ended up having 4 rounds of TACE, and each one roughly 10% reduction in the size of his liver mets. And it was a relief to be finally having a treatment that was working. But obviously it was quite a lot to travel, to fly out to Germany, have quite a difficult procedure, and then for Ian to have to fly back whilst feeling quite rubbish. So unfortunately in early summer, Ian had a trip to A&E because of some liver pain, which turned out to be just the swelling of the liver capsule. But at that time he had a scan just to confirm what was going on, and they told us that his bowel tumour was growing, and he had some mets in his lungs that they'd previously not been aware of and were a little concerned because they were now growing. So after discussion with Ian's oncologist in the UK, he decided to pause the treatment in Germany and to go on a chemo. So in July 2024, Ian decided to pause treatment in Germany and go on to his 3rd line treatment in the UK called Lunar. He had this alongside the bevacizumab infusion, which at this point was NHS funded but only for 3rd line treatment. He had 3 rounds of this Lunar. Unfortunately, it very much did not agree with him. It left him incredibly poorly, and after a couple of hospital admissions for infections, they did a scan and discovered that all of his cancer was growing quite rapidly. This was on the 26th of September 2024, and at this point I think Ian's spirit had been well and truly broken. He'd gone through the absolute mill, fighting as hard as he could, very proud, physically active, healthy man had been reduced to somebody who struggled to walk up the stairs to have a shower, who couldn't, make meals for his family, which is something he loved doing. And at that point I could see that mentally he was done. On the 5th of October 2024, Ian had an appointment with his oncologist to discuss his treatment, and it was at this point that he said he was done. He wasn't accepting any further treatment. He just wanted to be kept comfortable and try and enjoy what time he had left. The initial plan was to do some of this third-line chemo and go back to Germany, but unfortunately it had left Ian so unwell that he physically couldn't handle it. If it had been available in the UK, he might have been able to, he might have been willing to give it a go. But unfortunately, he was not physically able to travel to Germany, have treatment, and then fly back home. For a little while, Ian started to struggle with fluid building up in his abdomen, something called ascites. He was booked in to have them drained a couple of times. The first time he went in and they realised he was quite a tricky case and he needed the more senior consultant, so we were sent home. On the 5th of November 2024, he had his second appointment to go in and have this fluid drained. Unfortunately, he woke up in great pain. I don't know how we got him out of the house and into the car. In hindsight, we probably should have called an ambulance, but he was incredibly proud and did not like me doing so. So we somehow got out to the car, turned up for his appointment, and I think they took one look at him and just rushed him through to a side room. They then sent him off for a scan so they could get to grips of where this fluid was to help drain it. And unfortunately, this scan showed that whilst there was fluid in his abdomen, the fluid was not the problem. In actual fact, the swelling was his liver swelling because of the tumours, and his liver was failing, and that in actual fact, he was at end of life. We had the ominous discussion where the doctors asked him where he would like to die. Initially, Ian's plans were to die at home, but because he'd been in such great pain on the Monday, the 5th of November, he wanted to be where there was immediate access to pain relief, and so he chose to stay in hospital. The hospital were wonderful and rallied round us. He was obviously already in a side room, and they brought me a bed. People rallied round, the kids were brought in to say goodbye, and I stayed with him by his side until Sunday the 10th of November 2024, where he peacefully passed away in his sleep, 26 months after his diagnosis, and at the age of 50, his fight was over. I'll be honest, I don't really know how to end this video. It is now the 20-something of January 2025, and it feels like both forever and no time at all since all of this happened. Some of the memories and some of the details from his cancer treatment are still sharp as a bell in my mind, and some of them I was surprised that I couldn't remember. Ian used to do his TikTok videos and would talk about his treatment, and it would frustrate me when he'd forget how many he'd had and the rough dates. But trying to write these down for this video, a lot of them escaped me, so I think I might owe him an apology. Overall, I think Ian had 24 rounds of pretty gruelling chemo. Aside from when the steroids made him particularly grumpy, he handled it all with grace and with a strength that I don't know that I could have found personally, and I'm so proud of him for that. So I'm going to end this video here before I start absolutely bawling, but that's just a general rundown of how life has been for my family since the end of July 2022. So thank you so much for listening.